I have to say that for me, Paul Rateau is one of the best Leibniz scholar in Leibniz theodicy, for at least for me. Maybe he's going to say that is not really.
That's very kind of you. Very
but
kind.
Well, let me introduce a little bit. Let me talk about a little bit of his curriculum. Right now, he is president of the. I'm going to say in English because my French is kaput. He's president of the Society of Leibnizian Studies in French. He's vice president of the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Gesellschaft, and also he's responsible of the Bulletin Leibnizian in the by gathering all the critical biographic reviews of Leibniz in the archives of Filosofía, Archives de Filosofía. Some of his major publications, well, he's going to talk to you about one of them in specific. That is the last he made, his last book. He had organized several colloquiums and congress in French. I'm not going to read because my French is terrible. Some of his publications are, for example, Leibniz and the Problem of Evil. That was published in Oxford University Press. Leibniz et le meilleur de modèles possibles. Sorry for my French. Well, he also makes some editions about Leibniz. For example, Leibniz profession of the philosopher, and his dialogues on moral and religion. He also worked as director or co-director of some of Leibniz works in French, as the monadology, as monades et mondes, for example. And he has several chapters, several articles. One of the best is one that was published in 2015 in a book that I was the main editor, and he also collaborated with us in one book that we published in Mares. And his chapter was named La noción problemática del mal metafísico. So you can buy those books if you don't speak French. He has several collaborations in Spanish, and in English, of course. So you can know a little bit more about his work. And so, Paul, sorry for my terrible presentation, but my French is not quite well. But thank you very much for being here, and I'll let you with the public.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I'm very happy to be among you, and so first of all, hello to everybody. I'm going to speak about this book. I don't know if we can see it, but it is the last book I published, Leibniz on the Problem of Evil, published in Oxford University Press last year, and in which I trace the genesis and development of Leibniz's treatment of evil from the early writings to the Theodicy. And my paper today will be a part of chapter 5, and I will focus on the question of the way Leibniz want to demonstrate the thesis that God creates the best possible world. So to start, Leibniz Theodicy is a very disconcerting book. It is a long and thick text whose structure is very composite, as you know. It contains a variety of arguments and proofs that are of very unequal weight and value. As you can see, sometimes Leibniz considers a priori reasons, particularly when he speaks about the nature of God and of his justice. But however, in other passages, he uses probable arguments and even conjectures or reason drawn from experience, as when he discusses, for example, whether or not the quantity of good exceeds the quantity of evil in the universe as a whole. As you know, the value of a conjecture, a presumption, or a probability is obviously not the same as the value of an apodictic demonstration. Of course, philosophically, what is drawn from the a priori has greater significance than what comes from a posteriori considerations. So, according to some commentators, this use of different kinds of proofs, not all of which are strictly demonstrative, reveals a lack of rigor. It shows that, according to them, the Theodicy is not really a scientific book, and that Leibniz was more concerned to persuade than to provide valid arguments. That's the argument of Russell, for example, but of other commentators. And that's the reason why Theodicy is a book that is not considered as serious as other texts from Leibniz. But I believe, on the contrary, that the appeal to probable arguments, and not just arguments that are absolutely demonstrative, is justified, provided that they are considered within the relevant framework. I mean, within the framework of a defense, even if these same arguments can appear insufficient and inconclusive when considered within the framework of a properly doctrinal exposition. In my view, Theodicy must be seen as a kind of diptych, díptico in Espanol, a diptych composed of two panels. The one is defensive, the other is what I call doctrinal. Leibniz's rhetorical strategy presupposes that different forms of discourse are to be used depending on whether the aim is to refute Pierre Bayle's objections or to demonstrate positively the justice of God, or even, if possible, the existence of the best possible world. In my view, it is a mistake to confuse these two wings of the diptych and to fail to see the precise function of the various proofs Leibniz puts forward in the one and on the other. First of all, what I call the defensive wing is developed in particular in the discourse on the conformity of faith with reason, and in parts 2 and 3 of the Theodicy, where Leibniz offers a detailed examination of Bayle's objections. The defensive wing is composed of two kinds of defense. The one I call negative defense, or defense in the strict sense. Its aim is simply to reply to the objection and to show its weakness. So the aim is to refute Bayle's objections. The other kind of defense I call positive and supererogatory. It aims to go further, and to show that some a posteriori arguments speak in favor of divine providence. I speak about that particularly in chapter 4 of the book. In this defensive wing, we find arguments founded on ignorance of detail, conjectures, presumptions, and various degrees of probability. These do not have real demonstrative value, but are sufficient if we bear in mind their true aim, their true goal. Then the doctrinal wing, what I call the doctrinal wing of Theodicy, is developed in particular in part 1 of the book. It is likewise divided into two parts. First part, the theological component, which concern divine conduct. I mean God's moral and physical concourse with evil. In this part, Leibniz showed that sin cannot be attributed to God and establishing, though without absolutely demonstrating it, the existence of the best possible world. Second part of this doctrinal wing, what I call the anthropological component, which establishes the freedom of human beings and their responsibility with regard to evil, and sets out the moral rules that govern their actions. In this conference, I will show that this doctrinal wing, which claims to offer only a priori and demonstrative arguments, in fact includes arguments that provide moral or infallible but not absolute certainty. It is, I think, crucial to keep this twofold structure in mind, this diptych in mind, since it explains why Leibniz could give different answers to the same question depending on whether he is adopting the defensive or the doctrinal perspective. For example, with regard to the question of God's permission of evil, it is interesting to compare what Leibniz says in the Discourse, section 33, with what he says in part 1, section 23 and following. It's not the same argument because it takes part to a different wing. While these two wings of the diptych must be carefully distinguished, they must each be seen as essential components of Leibniz's theodicy. They make it real originality. In particular, it would be a mistake, I think, to consider the defensive wing to be of secondary importance. This would amount to denying the relevance for Leibniz of any argument that is not absolutely conclusive and is founded only on probability. So now my aim is to examine within the doctrinal part the following question. Is the existence of the best possible world demonstrable? In the Theodicy, does Leibniz demonstrate, in the true sense of the term, that God created the best of all possible worlds? Big question. For Leibniz, the criteria of a demonstration are particularly demanding. Not only must the form of the argument be logically correct, but all of the premises must be fully proven, or in other words, must themselves have been demonstrated. So a demonstration consists in showing by analysis a resolution the inherence of the predicate in the subject. And as you know, only truths of reason are demonstrable in the strict sense, insofar as their analysis is carried out in a finite number of steps, either because they can be reduced to previously demonstrated truth, or because they are directly reducible to first principle of the form A is A, such that the inherence of the predicate in the subject is made manifest. Such truth of reason, are necessary in that their negation implies a contradiction. They offer absolute certitude. Geometry, logic, metaphysics are the three disciplines to which these truths belong. By contrast, as you know, truth of fact cannot be demonstrated in the strict sense of what is a demonstration. They can only be proven since their analysis is never complete, but continues to infinity. It approaches the form of an entity tangentially without ever reaching it. For in order to explain the least contingent thing, one must know not only its causes, but also because of the relation that each thing has to all other things of the universe. The universe as a whole, as well as the reason for which God chose to create this universe rather than another equally possible one. God only is capable of such a priori knowledge, which does not amount to a demonstration for him either. Leibniz is very clear about that. For God does not see the final step of the analysis, of which there is none, but comprehends in a single intuition, at a glance, as it were, the infinite series of reasons. This truth of fact or contingents, since their opposite is possible in itself, and their certainty is moral. As you know, the mathematical comparison with commensurable and incommensurable quantities provides an illustration of this difference between these two kinds of truths. So now, both the world and the creative act by which it comes into being are contingent. In declaring in section 8 of the Theodicy that God could not have failed to choose the best, Leibniz does not mean that God could not have not chosen the best, but that he was obliged to choose it, and would have failed, that is, would have been at fault, if he had chosen other than he did. This obligation to do the best is a necessity that is internal to God. It comes not from something that is external to God. So this obligation to do the best, is a necessity that is internal to God. It is not absolute, since it does not render impossible every choice other than that of the best. Nor does it render what God has not chosen, other possible worlds, contradictory. So in its doctrinal part, Theodicy can demonstrate that God is just, because justice is among the perfections that make up the definition of the Supreme Being. However, strictly speaking, it can demonstrate neither that he always chooses the best, nor a fortiori that the existing universe is the most perfect possible. This is not because Theodicy is somehow imperfect or deficient, but rather because such a demonstration is impossible, not only in fact, given the limits of our intelligence, of our understanding, but also in principle, even for God himself, owing to the nature of contingent propositions. In fact, we would be in a position to demonstrate a priori that God created the best possible world only if his choice were absolutely necessary, or in other words, if his choice were not free. As Leibniz writes in a text from the early 1680-1684, I quote, "The first principle concerning existences is this proposition: God wills to choose the most perfect, perfectissimum. God wills to choose the most perfect. This proposition cannot be demonstrated. It is the first of all proposition of fact, that is, the origin of all contingent existence. It is one and the same thing to say that God is free and that this proposition is an indemonstrable principle. For if a reason could be given for this first divine decree, by that very fact, God would not have made it freely. Therefore, I maintain, say Leibniz, that this proposition can be compared to identity statements. For just as the proposition A is A, or a thing is equal to itself, so the proposition God wills the most perfect cannot be demonstrated. This proposition is the origin of the transition from the possibility to the existence of creation. End of the quotation. So such a demonstration is impossible because God's will is only inclined but not necessitated by his understanding, which represent to him what is best. Only that which is logically or metaphysically necessary is demonstrable. Therefore, to affirm that God is free and the world contingent entails that a demonstration of the existence of the best possible world is unachievable. So, in his book, a very famous book, Leibniz, Determinist, Theist, Idealist, Robert Adams has criticized Leibniz's arguments that aims to show that the proposition God chooses the best is a contingent truth. If the contingency of a world is grounded in the existence of other possible worlds, the contingency of God's choice to create this world rather than some other seems, according to Robert Adams, much more difficult to establish. For Leibniz, this choice is contingent because the decree, I quote, "The decree to always do what is most perfect is a free decree of God." See Discourse on Metaphysics, section 13. The argument, as Adam says, the argument is problematic in that it presupposes that God can freely give himself the will to always do what is best, and consequently that he can will to will. To grant this will to will would lead to an infinite regress, since it implies that every will must be based on a prior one that literally wills it, and that one on another, and so on, to infinity. Elsewhere, Leibniz explicitly rejects this idea, affirming that the will cannot be under the control of the will. Leibniz offers two main reasons for this. First, one cannot will to will something without already willing it, so that the redoubling of the will is useless and even absurd. Second, the infinite regress violates the principle of sufficient reason, since it would be impossible to arrive at an original will that is the reason of all the others, because the regress is infinite. So you go from a will to another and so on. As a result, one would never be able to will anything, because each will requires another one, and this new will another one, and so on. So that's the first difficulty. But beyond this first difficulty, we must consider, I think, Leibniz's main argument for the claim that God's choice of the best is contingent, namely, that every other choice by God, that is, other than the best, remain in itself possible. That's the main argument. That's Leibniz's main argument for his claim, that another choice by God remain in itself possible, another choice than the best. That God does not choose the best does not imply contradiction. Is this so obvious? Can the infinitely perfect and good being, God, truly act contrary to the dictates of his wisdom, that is, act wrongly, if to act wrongly is to choose other than what one ought? God's nature excludes all imperfection, error, and sin. On this point, Leibniz draws a distinction between the good angels who can sin, even if it is certain that they will not sin, and God himself, who is strictly incapable of sinning, since to do so would contradict his absolute perfection. So Robert Adams writes his conclusion. Thus, Leibniz seems unable to escape the conclusion that it is demonstrable and as logically necessary that God, as an absolutely perfect being, does what is the best. So, conclusion is that for Robert Adams, Leibniz cannot escape the conclusion that the thesis that God chooses the best possible world is demonstrable. So in a previous book, it was the French version of Leibniz on the problem of evil. In a previous book, so I arrived at the same conclusion by a different route while examining the implications of the moral necessity of the best for God. So I share the same conclusion with Robert Adams. There in this book, I paid special attention to the text in which Leibniz maintains that a choice other than the best is contradictory, since it would result in the destruction of God. See, for example, Theodicy section 129, in which Leibniz says, I quote, "If God were to choose what is not the best absolutely and on the whole, that would be a greater evil than all the individual evils which he could prevent by this means. This wrong choice would destroy his wisdom and goodness," which means destroy God himself. A choice of something other than the best would be a bad choice, and hence a sin. However, a sin on God's part would imply a negation of his divinity. For this reason, such a choice is absolutely impossible and not merely morally impossible. I quote another quotation taken from section 131. I quote, "In God, every fault would represent a sin. It would be even more than sin, for it would destroy divinity. And it would be a great fault in him not to choose the best. And it would be a great fault in him not to choose the best. I have said this many times. Thus, he would be preventing sin by something worse than all sin." So it's a way to say that if you try to avoid sin, will be worse. The sin of God will be worse than all the sins committed in the universe. Here I would like to reconsider this conclusion, which I shared with Robert Adams. Since this conclusion, Robert Adams defend and that I shared with him, that's it is possible to demonstrate that God chooses the best, because God cannot choose something else than the best. I will reconsider this conclusion, since this conclusion tends to remove the distinction between moral necessity and logical or metaphysical necessity in God, and to affirm that God simply cannot choose anything other than the best. In fact, I think it is difficult to believe that in the same text, the Theodicy, Leibniz could have defended two contradictory theses. First, that God's choice of the best is contingent, and second, that the choice of anything other than the best is absolutely impossible, in that it is incompatible with God's perfect nature. Could Leibniz have failed to notice this contradiction? Perhaps he did overlook it, since in fact it is only apparent. Might it not arise from an ambiguity in the meaning of being possible, possibly, and being able to, poder? As Leibniz explained in section 234, I quote, God chose between different courses, all of which were possible. Thus, metaphysically speaking, il pouvait, in French, he could have chosen or done what was not the best, but he could not, morally speaking, have done so. I think it's very important quotation. One must distinguish the question of possibility from that of actuality, just as one must distinguish power from the will, power and will. When we consider a possible in itself, a substance, an event, or a world, its intelligibility and its presupposition, we consider it independently of God's will and independently of his actual choice. Every possible is represented in the divine understanding and can be the object of his power. Because his omnipotence extends to everything possible, it can be said that God is able to create a world that is less perfect than ours, which is the best. Thus, with respect to the attribute of omnipotence, God's choice of the best is contingent. If we now consider those things that actually exist, the question is quite different, since we must now take into account God's will, his holiness, and his hands. Here, the choice of a world less perfect than ours is impossible, since that would imply an imperfection in God. With respect to the attributes of wisdom and goodness, it is necessary, morally speaking, that God choose and actualize the best. A world worse than a world worse than ours, must be considered as a possible object of his omnipotence, but not of his will. So, between the possible and the actual, that is, the creation of a single world from among the infinite number of possible worlds, three levels be distinguished. First level, God's omnipotence is limited by the possible, so much so that whatever is logically or metaphysically impossible is impossible for God. God cannot create a square cycle, nor bring it about, for example, that a being is and is not at the same time. So the omnipotence of God is limited by the restriction of what is possible, what does not imply contradiction. That's the first level. Second level, God's omnipotence extends to all possibles and to their infinite combination, which are called possible worlds, which are in an infinite number. Third level, the infinite wisdom and perfect goodness joined to this omnipotence lead to the choice of a unique combination of possibles, the only world that God is morally able to create without sinning. By virtue of his omnipotence, God can do whatever is possible. However, his wisdom and goodness lead him to bring into existence what is best. This moral necessity, however strong and binding it may be in God, cannot alter the nature of the contention, the divine choice of the best, and render it absolutely necessary. Thus, it is possible to say at the same time, though in two different senses, that God can choose other than the best in light of his omnipotence, and that he cannot choose other than the best in the light of his wisdom and goodness. I think the distinction between proximate power, in French pouvoir prochain, and remote power, in French pouvoir éloigné, this distinction is important, and it can help to shed light on this point, although it should be taken as more than an analogy. Remote power concerns logical or metaphysical possibility. For example, the ability of the damned to make amends and be saved, or of the elect to sin and to be damned. However, this is rendered impossible ex hypothesi, or accidentally, by the proximate power, namely the strong habit of sinning in the damned and the strong habit of doing good in the elect, or in the blessed. By way of illustrating, Leibniz borrows the following comparison from the French theologian Pierre Nicole. I quote, it is a quotation taken from section 282. It is considered impossible that a wise and serious magistrate who has not taken leave of his senses should publicly commit some outrageous action, as for example, to run about the streets naked in order to make people laugh. It is the same in a sense with the blessed, the elect. They are even less capable of sinning, and the necessity that forbids them to sin is one of the same mind. So it is a very interesting comparison. This remote power which still remains, is the condition sine qua non of the freedom of rational agents. God's omnipotence, considered prior to creation as the power to create whatever is possible, can be viewed by analogy with this remote power, which is constantly enjoyed by created spirits. However, the same omnipotence can also be compared with their proximate power insofar as it is subordinate to the dictates of wisdom. Therefore, God is not absolutely, but only morally necessitated to choose the best. Consequently, the proposition God always chooses the best is not demonstrable in the strict sense of the term. Must we then conclude that the doctrinal part of theodicy does not ultimately contain any decisive argument in favor of the existence of the best possible world, so that on this point we are left with nothing more than mere belief? Certainly not. The thesis that God created the best possible universe is a contingent truth which, given its nature, cannot be demonstrated. Nevertheless, it can be proved, since there are a priori reasons in its favor based on our knowledge of the divine perfection. The thesis is convincing, though not entirely conclusive, since the proof does not amount to a demonstration in the strict sense of the term. How then should we characterize the arguments that Leibniz develops with regard to the doctrinal part of his theodicy? These arguments are not mere presumptions nor pure conjectures. However, as we have seen, they are not demonstrations in the strict sense of the term. To understand their particular status, we must return to Leibniz's conception of demonstration. Leibniz distinguishes two kinds of demonstration. First, what he calls in the Discourse on Metaphysics, section 13, what he calls demonstration of necessity, which concern truth of reason and are demonstration in the strict sense. And second, what Leibniz calls demonstration of probability, or what he calls moral demonstrations. The goal of these latter demonstration of probability or moral demonstration, is to assess the degree of verisimilitude and credibility of a thesis in areas where it is not possible to achieve absolute certainty by accurately weighing the reason in its favor. When the question at issue is of practical nature, for example, a medical consultation, a war council, or legal litigation, this involves gathering together all the available facts and evidence to investigate the circumstances so as to be able to determine the most reasonable course of action and thus to make the best choice. This kind of demonstrations involves bringing together various proofs of different kinds and weight, experience, appearances, presumptions, inductions based on particular facts, etc., and all of which converge on the same conclusion. The result is a demonstration that approaches the highest level of certainty, but is not entirely conclusive. For this reason, it is considered an inferior form of demonstration. Nevertheless, it remains extremely useful and fecund on the practical level. So, what about the argumentation that Leibniz employs in the doctrinal part of theodicy? It seems that the a priori argumentation that Leibniz employs in the doctrine on behalf of the thesis that God chooses the best possible world as an intermediary status. An intermediary status between these two kinds of demonstration. Like demonstration of probability, it concerns truth of facts. It belongs to the realm of probable, but in the highest possible degree, which Leibniz calls infinite probability or moral certainty, in contrast to metaphysical necessity, which is restricted to what Leibniz called demonstration of necessity. The existence of the best possible world is not a mere supposition or a hypothesis, nor simply a presumption to be acted in the absence of a formal proof of the contrary. It is a morally certain thesis, that is, I quote, incomparably more probable than the opposite, and of which we have infallible certainty. In fact, Leibniz prefers the adjective infallible to moral, because the certainty is founded exclusively on a priori considerations, whereas moral certainty applies to inferences based on experience, authority, and testimony. For example, the proof of divine intelligence based on the beauty and finality observable in nature, or another example, the proof of the reality of phenomena or the motives of credibility in favor of the truth of the Christian religion. That sort of cases of moral certainty. However, the arguments on which the thesis of the best possible world rests also have characteristics in common with demonstration of necessity, insofar as these arguments are a priori and based on a certain kind of necessity, namely what Leibniz called moral necessity, which is a form of internal obligation. That sort of necessity, you can see the chapter 5 of my book. Then one word of conclusion. We can now see why Leibniz defines theodicy as, I quote, a quasi kind of science, in his correspondence with Debus, not only because of the existence of the defensive wing, but also because theodicy contains no demonstration of necessity in its doctrinal wing. The lack of demonstration is the counterpart of God's freedom and the contingency of the universe. The proposition God always chooses the best, and the proposition ours is the best possible world, are proved by reason, based in the a priori, but they are not demonstrable on account of their contingency. They are infallible, but not absolutely certain. Thank you.